The next piece that we're going to move on to is around the trend presentation. So let me just change screens for you guys. So welcome to a conversation about the trends that are influencing the way we work and engage in our communities in 2021. Since I've only got 30 minutes, I'm going to do a very high level overview presentation, but I've got a lot packed in, so let's get going. I'm going to talk about first the digital age that we find ourselves in, have a look at that age of the citizen and what that actually means for us. Took a little bit about the technology drivers that are really changing the potential of our engagements going forward. And finally, looking at some of the lessons from 2020. This really, for me, was a quote that summed up 2020. And I think it also sets the tone of what's to come in the next 3 to 5 years. COVID showed us that digital is an essential part of every government's communication toolset. And I thought, let's actually have a look at that in the perspective of the digital economy and what's actually happened over the last 50 years. So if we have a look, starting back in the 1980s, we were starting out on that sort of siloed journey, very much sitting on a PC in your own world. You weren't connected to anyone. And in that 50 years, the increase in automation and connectedness that has been enabled through the processing power of technology has just been phenomenal. And so we now absolutely are sitting in Web 4.0 as digital organizations, and our expectations from our customers and our citizens is very much in this particular space. And we'll see that this is going to continue to accelerate with the impacts of COVID, as many of the pieces that I'm going to talk about will show. So we hear this a lot. COVID accelerated the digital transformation, and I'm sure that you've seen lots of things on social media. But what I thought I'd do is just try and provide some context around what actually happened during COVID, and particularly in that 20-week period. And so I've taken 2 data points. The first from Apple. Apple took 42 years to get to a $1 trillion valuation company. It took them 20 weeks to get to a $2 trillion valuation. Just phenomenal. Now, for many of us, 2 trillion doesn't mean a lot. So I thought what I'd do is try and contextualize that for our Australian customers and say, Apple is now worth the same amount as our GDP in 2020 for Australia. This just shows you the power and might of big tech, but it also shows you what 2020 actually did. I thought I'd just have a look at some of the mega trends, just at this helicopter view, and actually get a sense of some of the things that are going on. Now, we're not going to certainly talk about all of these different trends, but what I wanted to show you, there's 35 mega trends here, according to Deloitte's global review, and they cover technology, society, environment, economics, and politics. But what I wanted to show you here is the dark blue are actually showing the tech trends. And there are 12 of the 35 that are considered mega trends. And this is the first time that we're actually seeing technology now overtaking some of those other trends, and also heavily skewing the way those other trends are being delivered. So if we look at things like additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, automation, blockchain systems, geospatial technology, social media, technization of the healthcare. These are all things that have touched most of us over 2020 and are going to accelerate what's going to be expected. I'm going to talk about a couple of these, but I just thought it would be interesting to see how much technology is actually impacting on all of the different categories that we work across. But governments have really stepped up into this new world. And we see that they've actually accelerated in 3 different dimensions: the digital infrastructure and digital workforce, and facing into connecting their citizens is not just useful for that pandemic, it's actually going to lay the foundations for digital governments in the future. And as Adam said, we saw many of our customers really innovating and experimenting through this particular period and starting to learn about what might be possible. Let's take a moment to actually understand who that citizen is and what that connectivity might look like, particularly as they are really at the core of all of our digital strategies. We believe that we're in the age of the citizen, a digitally savvy citizen that is you. And if you put yourself for a moment in this particular spot, think about what you're expecting from NRMA, Walmart, or even your local council. Your interactions and expectations are being set by Facebook, eBay, Amazon, and Netflix. They will basically set the standard by which you are asking your council and your local governments to play by. What are some of the implications around this? We all know that organizations are now being challenged to step up digitally. So whether you're in private sector, not for profit, or in government, digital expectations have lifted. And to create that real, smooth digital experience, citizens are looking for effectiveness, ease, and emotion. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. We also know that social media is not that democratic platform for these kind of conversations, and trust is hard won and easily lost online. But if we have a look at this diagram, which shows the digital maturity horizon moving through different digital engagement, and we look at effectiveness first, this is really the baseline that customers and our citizens are looking at. And we know that 95% of our communities have been able to achieve access through Wi-Fi and internet and the availability of devices. We've definitely come a long way in this area, but we cannot underestimate that there's still a ways to go with some of the accessibility in rural and remote communities, and extra focus needs to be put in this in our engagements going forward. Most of our customers are sitting in this middle section over here. They're working really hard on innovative engagements and customizing for their community some of those collaborations. But really, the future is that third horizon. And this is really where citizens are wanting to move to. And this is what those other platforms are giving them. Those other platforms are giving them connection and collaboration and co-creation capability. And this is where we need to move to with our citizen engagements, making sure that they're stimulating, interesting, and provide some of that real opportunity to connect. Citizen connectivity in 2020 exposed some real major infrastructure and connectivity issues, particularly in rural and remote communities. The benefits of ramping up digital solutions and promoting virtualization of services can only fully be realized when all citizens have access to such services. There's a real urgent need to build public infrastructure that allows better access to digital solutions, especially for the most marginalized populations. We have to close that digital divide. A recent headline called Australian Wi-Fi embarrassingly slow. And when we actually have a look at the Wi-Fi speeds and accessibility in Australia, it's pretty patchy at best. And when you move into rural and remote Australia, it's even worse. According to the OECD, our Wi-Fi speeds in Australia have fallen to 68th in the global internet rankings, making us the 4th slowest country in broadband in the OECD. This will be having direct impacts on our digital business for economic recovery in rural areas of Australia. And if we actually have a look at how this compares to perhaps some other countries, our near neighbours, our New Zealand neighbours, they rank 24th with an average download speed of 103 megabits per second compared to Australia's 41. In Canada, rates 16 with speeds of 122 megabits. And we also know that if we have a look at what's happening in the US, they're sitting at 11 with 130 megabits. So this is a real area that Australia needs to focus on, or all of those technology advancements are really going to be minimized. We know as well that our customers and our citizens are really looking for that total experience. They want to have a unified experience. They want governments to be able to provide them extra level of customization and personalization. They're expecting that the experience affects all parts of their life, and they're looking to be able to build trust and improve the service delivery. And this is a real area of opportunity, particularly in local governments. I don't think this will come as a surprise that compared with private sector, government is behind the curve on delivering that seamless digital experience, but it's catching up fast. And 2020 did a huge amount in Australia for making digital a core part of every organisation's tool set. But we know that there's a couple of things that really need to be focused on if this is actually going to continue to improve. And personalization is one of them. We cannot take the one size fits all mentality. We also have to look at how do we take those frustrating jumping through the hoop and barriers that often we put into our engagements out of there. And how do we actually anticipate and think proactively about what might our community and our users actually want next? There's some good news, though, on all of this front. COVID dramatically amplified the long-term behavioural and attitudinal, I suppose, thinking around digital. And what we're seeing here is that research shows that people are actually open and willing to consider new digital services and options and methods of engagement. This is really great news for digital engagement specialists, and I feel that it gives us permission to experiment across the generations. Research shows that our customers are time poor, overwhelmed, and impatient. Attention is hard to attract and hard to hold. Our digital engagement projects must make it simpler and easier for citizens to engage. This year saw a significant rise in the global movement for inclusion across industries, including governments. Policies are being revisited to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are reflected in public policy and public practice. Governments are putting more focus into how this might be applied in digital engagement. We've also seen in the last year a significant rise in digital engagement projects that were aimed specifically at children, recognizing that their voices and insights are relevant and important. Banyule City Council and Ipswich City Council delivered some really interesting, innovative community engagement projects. Globally, citizens are finding their voice and want to influence the decision-making of their local governments and state governments. Social movements like Me Too, Enough, Black Lives Matter, the Extinction Rebellion are all fueling the desire to be heard and to alter legacy thinking and policies. Technology is also allowing community groups to learn from each other and exercise their democratic rights through voting power and holding our political leaders to account. This is something that we do need to keep an eye on, and it's definitely something that is growing. We've all spent some long periods of time working from home in the last 12 months, and this has naturally driven a real interest in all things local and a sense of localism. We're all seeking those services and infrastructure and green space close to our houses. And this is providing some really interesting economic opportunities and challenges at a suburban and local level. What we're also seeing is the rise of organisations like ICLEI, which has over 1,700 local and regional global members committed to sustainable urban development. We also see events like Localisation Day on the rise, and they might provide the opportunity in your organisation. One of the other things that we're starting to see is literature being produced showing how to invest in local community, taking our money away from corporate, putting your money where your life is. There's also some really interesting advancements around crowdsourcing and community projects that are worth investigating if you're involved in economic recovery. Legislation in the US and Australia now allows for crowdfunding and opens some really interesting opportunities. This is a final trend that I want to talk about in thinking about our citizens, and it's a bleeding edge trend, but it's one to be aware of. In 2023, Gartner predicts that the individual activities of 40% of our global population will be tracked digitally in order to influence behavior. There are plenty of ethical questions that will sit alongside this trend, but it's worth watching. We already observe the UK government has been experimenting with behavioural economics and nudging, and as has the Australian Tax Department here. They're testing this capability. Definitely one to watch. Have I still got you? I know that we have moved through this quite quickly. I'm going to just take a change of pace now and shift gears and look at some of the technology advancements around that scaling infrastructure piece that's really enabled a lot of what we've seen over the last year. So all modern organizations have now adopted cloud computing and software as a service. These are basically allowing them to be efficient, effective, and scalable. So if you think about Zoom or Teams or AWS, Dropbox or Jira, what these technologies allowed you to do through COVID, and they were only possible through these cornerstone technologies. If we actually have a look at the technologies, these foundational technologies are also allowing for more advanced computing, and I know it's a lot to take on board. But if we don't have those software as a service and those cloud computing capabilities, you won't be able to take advantage of some of the leading and more advanced computing capabilities like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, or virtual reality. And we know that these are going to be so important in engagements going forward. In fact, many of our customers are really testing the virtual reality capability. These cornerstone technologies also enable a variety of new business models that are interesting not only for yourself, but for people in your community. So business models like remote first, the sharing economy, or crowdsourcing. These technologies also allow small to medium-sized businesses to enter the global market and compete. And surprisingly, they also enable smaller and often remote teams. So if we have a look at cloud technology, it's been the single most significant tech trend in the last few years. Cloud technology is essential for any organization that's operating in 2021. It provides tremendous scaling capability on demand. It improves speed at a fraction of the cost of self-hosting. And it also takes advantages of advanced functionality that the cloud offers. For example, AWS AI sentiment analysis that we're using, or Google's crowdsourcing Mechanical Turk. Adam spoke about privacy and security. And this is a core concern for every organization. Digital engagement is an area we need to get serious about, privacy and security of data. We need to make sure that our teams are upskilled, that there's a regular focus on upgrading systems, processes, and protocols to ensure that our customer data is protected. Now that we can work from anywhere, it's really important to make sure that we're using trusted networks, auto-locking our screens, and not leaving our computers unattended. Making sure that we never use generic logins and that we regularly change our passwords. Cybersecurity loopholes are often found at this very, very base level, and all of us have a role to play in making sure that our systems and our customer data is secured. I just mentioned this particular area of data privacy, which has spilled out into the news. So we've got our two superpowers, Facebook and Apple, facing off against each other at the moment because Facebook is starting to impinge on customer data privacy, and Apple has taken offense to this, as have many privacy, I suppose, and experts. And what we're basically seeing is that in the weeks and months to come, that if you are using an Apple device, they're going to ask you to explicitly agree to allowing Facebook to follow you and to monitor your web activity. This will be something for us to watch because I think it will have an impact on how data privacy is seen across the board. 2020 was a big year, and let's have a look at a couple of the lessons that we learned from 2020. We already know that digital transformation was accelerated by COVID. In fact, COVID generated in 20 weeks more than we've all been able to achieve in 10 years, certainly in Australia. But it's also provided an amazing opportunity for our HiVE community. We've seen massive digital transformation across our entire customer base. And finally, for many of you, you've been able to experiment with the full toolbox of features that we offer, from participatory budgeting all the way through to interactive mapping, providing new ways to connect with your community and stakeholder. Over the next few Wednesdays, we're going to hear from local governments across the globe who are innovating and experimenting and bringing those stories to you. We also know that mobile is now the most common tech device being used to access digital information. We should be taking a mobile-first approach to content and user experience, ensuring that the total experience your community is seeking. This is also an area of opportunity, particularly when designing for youth. 2020 and the US elections showed that we cannot be complacent about our hard-won democracy. We started to understand that digital platforms influence the quality of democracies, and we now have to reconsider how we use Twitter and Facebook for our community engagements, as they were designed primarily as advertising platforms and do not offer the appropriate conditions for civic engagement. Working from home, well, this has certainly driven a major change in reimagining where and how we work. Predictions are that this will revolutionize work forever. Location liberation is altering most aspects of how and where we work and what we need to work effectively and collaboratively. It's also made visible the hidden infrastructure and connectivity issues. Work from anywhere, sure, but as long as it's got internet. Let's have a look a little bit more detail at what the social experiment actually, the impact of that. So this is an Australian statistic from demographer Bernard Salt, and he said in 2016, 5% of the population reported working from home. But if after COVID, another 5% moved to full-time working from home, that will be another 600,000 people not commuting into Australian cities every day. He said that this was a very conservative forecast. And I know from all of the reading that I've done is that people are slow to come back into the cities and things will never be as they were. I know that this is something that's on every urban planner's mind, but it's something for us to consider about what will this mean for small businesses, arts and culture and public transport, and what opportunities does it actually allow for? Working from home had a huge ripple effect. We saw, particularly in Australia, regional remote areas becoming home. We saw house prices rising to almost 8% in some of these areas. And finally, young people were able to afford a home that they could never afford in the city. Local becomes a priority for services. And public transport disruption is something that's really on state government's mind. How do they continue to fund and prioritize and reorganize their public transport based on where people are going? Corporate head offices are downsizing. HSBC, probably one of the most notable, to say that they would reduce their footprint globally by, to 40% of what it was before, but that they will invest in regional and suburban corporate hubs. And we're seeing this as a trend across many of the big corporates and even governments. We're seeing co-working spaces reimagined, space as a service. This will be one that's emerging, and we'll keep you posted on that. And finally, the 30-minute suburb that all of our urban planners have dreamt about suddenly become possible and potential reality. Regional Australia now becomes a place of aspiration, and for the regional and local councils, this is a real opportunity to be able to see whether they can hold on to these young people, if they can provide the access, resources, spaces and infrastructure that will allow these people to stay and continue to purchase homes, build businesses and have their families in this area. We're seeing that this may well lead to the regional rejuvenation that we've been pushing for in Australia for the last decade. Ultimately, when we reflect on the age of the citizen, the technology advances and the lessons in 2020, we realize the world has changed forever and the opportunity that digital engagement provides needs to be fully explored to meet the needs of our communities. I leave you with a couple of final closing thoughts. Digital platforms have made it really easy to connect, collaborate, and create with your communities. However, from our 10 years of experience at Harvest, we know that digital engagement requires just as much planning and consideration as your face-to-face engagements. This large-scale community feedback survey that was done by Engage Victoria in 2019 provides a useful reminder on what's important from our communities when engaging digitally or face-to-face. They really want to understand about how you're going to report back. They want us to be able to clarify what influence they can have on the decision that they're contributing to. And so I think just being able to start your engagements here and remember what's important to your community is very, very useful. But ultimately, on a final note, it's easy to get wrapped up in our KPIs, our timetables, and our own internal needs. But let's never forget who we are using digital to engage with. These are humans. Let's keep their faces front and center. Let's make sure that we're delivering creative, innovative, and meaningful engagement for our communities. We look forward to seeing how you will use the HiVE to innovate in 2021 and connect with your community, allowing them to shape the places that they live and work in. I'm really happy to take questions. Andrew, if there were any.
Not any questions yet, Cindy. Quite a few requests for your slides. So I'll obviously pass those on to you. But guys, if you've got any questions, yeah, just pop them in the chat or even speak out if you want.
We're happy to share the information, and we have recorded it, and we will be putting that up into our things. Have I got a question there? Okay, well, we'll move on.
Sorry, Cindy, there is a question. But how have you seen your users try to bridge the digital divide or decrease digital literacy issues?
I think this is really being driven at a local level, and it's quite fragmented. I don't think there's one size fits all. But we have seen some of our innovators really experiment. And I think that's probably one of the things that I would say, that they basically have tried small things. They've tried to use technology in new ways and to be able to hear different voices. So we've seen participatory budgeting being used. We've been seeing some of the social map capability being used. And Melbourne Water recently ran a project called Waterway Blitz, which got over 800 contributions over a period of time. And so I think we're seeing our community of digital experts trying different things. We're seeing, perhaps the use of virtual reality. We're seeing the combination of face-to-face information being fed back into digital engagements, combining the two together. But it's been a tough year. I think we've all been on a really steep learning curve, and I think the experimentation would be the one that I think is probably the most prevalent.
I'd just like to add something there as well. I think we've seen a big rise in QR codes, not just in our space, but generally across the world. So specifically in Australia, a lot of people now have to, when they go to a restaurant or a cafe or a building of some description, are using QR codes to check in. And I've certainly seen some of the accounts that I manage translate that into some of the digital engagement that they're doing. So I'll give a shout out to Charles Sturt. I've seen Georgina's in the room. They did a project, I think it was late last year, earlier this year, where they put the QR codes on a street that they were redoing. And so people walking along the street they're so used to scanning QR codes now, they could scan the QR code and that would take them directly through to the digital engagement platform for the Charles Sturt Council. So I've seen that a few times now, and I reckon we're going to see a lot more of that. People are so used to whipping their phone out, scanning a QR code, so why not use it to get people to visit your site?
Andrew, we've also seen, I suppose, the advent of the work that Jacinta Cubis is doing by using imagery to be able to get communities to be able to show what matters. So we're thinking about perhaps migrant communities or people that perhaps don't have English as their first language, or even older people, being able to show what they're thinking and feeling through imagery. And so we're doing a big experiment with Jacinta Cubis, who's a photojournalist, to be able to see how we might be able to use this going forward. So I feel that's something, again, about being able to bridge the digital divide, using innovative ways and experimenting and testing. So, I mean, that's still in early days, but we'll certainly keep you guys posted.
There's a question there about any projects currently using VR at the moment that we could take a look at. Sean from Banyul.
Banyul, Sean, there's a couple that are in work at the moment, and as soon as they go live, we'll tap you guys on the shoulder and let you know. There's some experimentation in this.
And then there was one, have we got any plans to work on ways to translate your tools for face-to-face workshops, for example, from Sarah, Canada Bay?
Sarah, I think we know that the Visioner tool has been something that's really being used quite extensively. And I know that Gather's also being used in some of those face-to-face. Some of our community engagement people are taking iPads out and letting people actually put those in the face-to-face meetings, and certainly capturing some of that information and putting it back into the digital engagements. Have you seen any others, Andrew?
No, I'd certainly say, as some of our Australian, New Zealand clients, obviously going back to face-to-face engagement, the power of the iPad has become quite apparent. People are taking the digital platform out to workshops or in-field events on an iPad, because there's a kind of sanitization around that as well. You can either hand the iPad over to the person and then wipe it down once they've filled out a Gather tool or a survey or whatever. But also, if the staff member just holds onto the iPad and works the person through an activity, then there's no need for that kind of sanitization and all that kind of stuff. So the iPad is coming kind of into its own place with that link to digital platforms and not having to have paper copies of things.